This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one country or one leader or one election cycle. This is about something quieter and far more dangerous, because what happens when power no longer needs tanks? What happens when control doesn't arrive with soldiers, but with spreadsheets, contracts, and infrastructure diagrams? There is a moment, rare, easy to miss, when a system stops using force and starts using dependence. No explosions, no declarations, just a subtle rewiring of survival itself. And once that happens, resistance doesn't look heroic anymore. It looks expensive. It looks like collapse. If you're watching this thinking, this sounds distant, this sounds foreign, stay with me. Because this model doesn't stay where it starts. And once it works once, it never stays contained. What replaced war here wasn't peace. It was something more efficient. And the mechanism that made it possible is already in motion. Power today is not held by flags or uniforms. It's held by systems you cannot vote out. What actually controls outcomes now is not who governs, but what keeps the lights on, what keeps money moving, what keeps an economy breathing. And that's the shift most people missed. Because once survival is tied to a system you don't own, politics becomes cosmetic. You can change speeches, you can change slogans, you can even change leaders. But if energy, revenue, and infrastructure flow through channels you don't control, your choices are already narrowed. This is how leverage replaces invasion. You don't threaten destruction. You simply make cooperation the only affordable option. And here's the unsettling part. When this model works, it doesn't require constant enforcement. The system polices itself. Disobedience triggers shortages. Shortages trigger instability. Instability triggers compliance. No orders required. And once a state learns this lesson, it doesn't forget it. Which raises the next question: how did this kind of control become normal? The most dangerous changes don't arrive suddenly. They arrive politely. They show up as temporary measures, as exceptions, as just this once. Before, power looked loud. It demanded obedience through force. You could see it. You could resist it. Now, power prefers patience. Before, pressure came from outside. Now it's internalized. A government doesn't need to be threatened anymore. It only needs to remember what happens when the system pauses. When revenue stops, when fuel doesn't move, when markets close their doors quietly. That shift didn't happen overnight. It was normalized step by step until dependence felt like stability. And once dependence feels safe, autonomy starts to feel reckless. That's the trade most people never see happening. Because nothing is announced, nothing is voted on, nothing is explained, the system just updates itself. And once it does, the cost of saying no becomes higher than the cost of submission. Which brings us to the moment when this theory stopped being abstract and became real. The shift stopped being theoretical. The moment force was taken off the table and replaced with a deal, not a treaty, not a peace agreement, a transaction. Military action was canceled, not because the threat disappeared, but because something more useful took its place. A signal was exchanged, quietly, deliberately. People were released, images circulated, families reunited. And that moment was presented as proof that the system was working. But look closer. This wasn't mercy. It was currency. A checkbox marked, a condition satisfied, access unlocked. Because in this model, human freedom isn't the outcome, it's the down payment. And once that payment is made, the real negotiation begins. Not over politics, but over assets that cannot walk away. If you're wondering why this felt sudden, why it felt almost easy, That's because the pressure had already done its work. The visible crisis wasn't the turning point. It was the confirmation. And what came next was far more permanent. Here's the part that almost never gets explained. Control doesn't come from ownership alone. It comes from irreplaceability. Because once a system is rebuilt in a specific way, with specific technology, specific capital, specific expertise, it can't simply be unplugged. That's the mechanism. Investment doesn't just restore production. It rewrites dependence. When infrastructure collapses, the question isn't who has resources, it's who can make them usable. And when only one pathway exists, one set of pipes, one financial corridor, one operating logic, choice disappears. Compliance becomes maintenance. The system rewards cooperation with flow. It punishes deviation with friction, not sanctions, not threats. Delays, shortages, quiet failures that compound, and toggle one valve, and the economy feels it immediately. Which is why the beneficiaries are obvious, and the costs are diffuse. Profits concentrate, risk disperses, and the state that accepts the rescue inherits a rule book it didn't write. By the time this is visible, the exit options are gone. Which brings us to the next shock. The moment when scale turned leverage into something much harder to escape. This is where the tempo changes. Because once the mechanism is in place, everything starts moving faster. Production targets, price calculations, supply projections, decisions ripple immediately. More flow means lower prices. Lower prices mean political pressure shifts. Markets react before governments do. And suddenly, what looked like a regional adjustment starts shaping global behavior. Budgets tighten elsewhere. Margins shrink. Leverage moves, all without a single public announcement. This is the advantage of economic force. It scales instantly. No votes, no authorizations, no public debate, just consequences. And if someone inside the system hesitates, if cooperation slows, if rules are questioned, the response isn't dramatic. It's technical. A delay here, a pause there, a recalculation that lands hardest where resilience is weakest. By the time anyone names the problem, the pressure has already worked. And that's the danger. Because once acceleration begins, it doesn't ask permission. It only asks who can endure the longest. This is where it reaches you. Because systems like this don't feel abstract to the people living inside them. They feel like smaller choices, shorter timelines, fewer margins for error. When energy becomes conditional, everything downstream tightens. Jobs depend on flow, prices depend on access. Stability depends on compliance. And you feel it not as policy, but as pressure, as uncertainty that never quite leaves, as the knowledge that one wrong move, one disrupted relationship can tip everything. That's what dependency does. It doesn't announce itself, it disciplines quietly. And if you're thinking, well, at least this avoids war, pause there. Because avoiding violence is not the same as avoiding harm. This system doesn't need force to change behavior. It just needs you to understand how much you stand to lose. If this feels familiar, if it sounds like a future you recognize, stay with me. Because this isn't the end of the chain. It's the middle. This is the moment it stops being local. Because once a system like this proves it can work, it doesn't stay contained. Energy doesn't respect borders. Prices don't either. When supply shifts in one place, pressure appears somewhere else. Budgets adjust. Alliances recalibrate. Assumptions quietly break. And countries watching this unfold draw a simple conclusion. This isn't about ideology anymore. It's about architecture. Who controls access? Who controls processing? Who controls the routes between? And once that architecture exists, it becomes a template, a way to shape behavior without confrontation, without headlines, without accountability, The ripple spreads not because it's imposed, but because it's efficient. Other states begin to ask the same question. What happens if our survival depends on someone else's infrastructure? That uncertainty doesn't resolve. It compounds, because the more interconnected the system becomes, the harder it is to tell where influence ends and dependence begins. Which leads us to the part everyone wants to skip, the future. From here, there are only three directions this can go. The first is adjustment. The system stabilizes. Dependence is accepted as the cost of access. Growth returns, but only inside the rules already written. Compliance becomes routine. And over time, the loss of autonomy feels normal. The second is erosion. Small breaches, quiet resistance. Delays that turn into disputes, trust thins. Capital hesitates, maintenance slips. The system still holds, but barely. Pressure rises without a clear breaking point. And then there is rupture. That's when one side decides the cost is too high. A contract is challenged. A red line is crossed. Flow stops. Not all at once, just enough. Revenues fall. Prices jump. Instability spreads inward. And the very dependence that once ensured control becomes a trigger for collapse. None of these paths are theoretical. They are built into the design. And the most unsettling part is that no one fully chooses which one happens. The system decides based on stress, en miscalculation, on timing, which is why the question now isn't what will happen next. It's how much pressure this structure can absorb before it chooses for everyone. There's a temptation at the end of a story like this to look for reassurance, to say this is smarter than war, cleaner, more humane, but systems don't care how they feel. They care whether they hold. And this one only works as long as pressure stays calibrated, as long as dependence remains survivable, as long as no one misjudges how much strain the structure can take. Because once control is embedded into survival itself, there is no neutral exit. Every response becomes risky, every correction destabilizing, and the most dangerous moment is not collapse. It's confidence. The belief that this can be managed indefinitely, that leverage can be applied forever, without backlash, without adaptation, without consequences moving faster than control. If you're still watching, it's because you recognize this pattern, not as a headline, not as foreign policy, but as a model, one that doesn't announce itself, one that travels quietly, one that doesn't need war to change the world. If you want to understand where this model goes next and how often it's already being tested, you'll need to keep following the system, not the spectacle. Because once power stops using force, it doesn't disappear. It just becomes harder to see